There are moments in life when fate presents us with a choice, but doesn't tell us the price to pay. Like Jonah Mercer, a cowboy living in the Montana wilderness, who spent half his life telling himself that love makes people weak. Then one day, his mail-order wife stepped off the wagon, carrying with her a secret past and a broken heart that needed to be healed. But have you ever wondered if someone came into your life, bringing both hope and danger? Would you open your heart or turn your back? If you had to choose between the safety of familiarity and a love that could save or hurt you all over again, which would you dare choose? And if it were you standing in the middle of a windy wilderness, in front of a stranger whose heart felt as if it had known him from a previous life, would you have the courage to call that place home? Join me in the story, The Lonely Cowboy waited for his mail-order bride. To find the answer for yourself. If you find this content touching, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey together. The wind from the northern mountains blew down onto the prairie like a long breath of the earth and sky in late autumn. The dry sagebrush rustled in the wind, carrying with it the familiar smell of red dust that people in the high plains, Wyoming territory, were all too familiar with. On the porch of an old wooden house, a man stood as still as a statue, his gray-brown eyes staring far away down the dirt road that stretched for more than half a mile. The man was Jonah Mercer, 42 years old, a middle-aged cowboy who had lived most of his life in the silence and cold wind. The sun was about to set behind Granite Ridge. The late afternoon bronze of the day had washed over the land, turning the nearly 480 acres of farmland into a vast carpet of golden light. But Jonah didn't mind the beauty. He stood there, his shoulder against the pine porch post, his calloused hands tucked deep into the pockets of his old sheepskin vest. His wide-brimmed hat shaded half his face, but it couldn't hide the faint wrinkles that stretched from the corners of his eyes, the traces of years of fighting alone with nature and memory. Today was different. Something made Jonah stand still longer than usual. In the silence of the land, in the wind whistling through the wooden fence, he was waiting for something bigger than storms, bigger than the long winters of the West. He was waiting for a mail-order bride, a strange woman, someone he had never met before, someone he had placed cautious, yet fragile, hope in. Jonah sighed, his eyes still on the road. He was not the type of man to express his emotional needs. He had grown up surrounded by horses, dust, and the unwritten rules of the West men had to be strong, silent, and self-sufficient in the face of loss. But no matter how tough he tried to appear, the years of loneliness had eaten away at him. After the sudden death of his wife and young child in a carriage accident 4 years ago, Jonah threw himself into his work to forget his grief. But the emptiness still lingered every morning when he woke up and every night when he warmed himself by the fire. He never said it out loud, but sometimes he was afraid that he would spend the rest of his years surrounded by nothing but drafts and sad memories. Am I too desperate to do this, or am I just afraid of dying in silence? The question made him stir slightly, as if his heart had just said what he had been avoiding. For the past 6 months, Jonah and the woman Clara Whitmore had corresponded regularly. Clara's letters were gentle and thoughtful, unadorned but sincere. She told of her desire to start over, of a place more peaceful than the turbulent cities of the East. Jonah was not a good speaker, but he responded with his own truth life on the farm, golden sunrises and endless evenings, and the loneliness he had learned to accept. Clara didn't promise love. Jonah didn't expect it either. He just wanted a partner, someone who would listen and be quiet when necessary. And yet, ever since he received Clara's letter of acceptance, his heart had suddenly warmed, a warmth he thought he had lost. Just then, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. Jonah looked up, startled. A thin trail of dust rose on the horizon, faint but distinct. Stagecoach was approaching. He swallowed, clutching the brim of his hat, his palms sweating despite the cold. After years of living as calm as a lake, his life was about to change direction. The wind picked up as the carriage approached, the sound of its wheels grinding against the dry earth echoing through the courtyard. 2 chestnut-colored horses pulled the carriage, and the driver wore a tall hat and a thick woolen scarf. When the carriage stopped in front of the courtyard, dust rose up, momentarily obscuring the silhouette of whoever was inside. Jonah took a deep breath. 2 steps. 3 steps. The car door opened. A woman stepped down. She paused a moment as she stepped onto the rough Wyoming earth. Her light brown hair streaked with silver was tied back under a simple bonnet. Her long, gray-blue dress was slightly frayed at the hem, but clean and modest. Her eyes, when she looked up at Jonah, were not those of someone frail or shy. There was something hard to name, a calm, a little tired, but also a warmth like the afternoon sun. Jonah swallowed. That gaze touched a place he thought was frozen. Clara spoke, softly but clearly. "Are you Jonah Mercer?" Jonah nodded. "Yes, it's me. Welcome to Wyoming." Clara smiled slightly. "Thank you for picking me up. It's been a long journey." In that moment, in the cold, western wind, Jonah felt something strange, as if the cabin behind him had just become a little brighter. Though he did not say it, he knew something in his life was beginning to change. The stagecoach rolled away, leaving the 2 men standing in the middle of the open field, bewildered like people who have forgotten how to start a new story. But that story, even though the 2 of them didn't know it yet, would be the story that would change their lives. As the stagecoach pulled away, the farmyard fell into an eerie silence. Not the kind that made you feel empty, but the silence of the moment before something big was about to begin. A light breeze blew through the wooden porch, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and grass, mixed with an unnamed sense of anticipation. Jonah Mercer straightened his posture and adjusted his hat brim. He was not a man who was easily flustered, but this moment made his heart sway slightly, like the surface of a lake touched by the wind. The woman standing before him, Clara Whitmore, was very different from the image he had seen in the letters. She was not gorgeously beautiful, not youthfully radiant, but she had the beauty of someone who had been through many storms, calm, gentle but not weak, and a look that seemed to hide a whole sky of the past behind. Clara adjusted her silver-tinted hair and looked around the farm. The dark brown stables, the long wooden fence that ran down to the stream, the sagebrush bushes blooming pale yellow. It was a vast canvas she had never seen before. She took a small breath, unable to hide her surprise and caution. "It's drier here than I expected," Clara said, her voice slightly hoarse from days of travel. "And the wind is strong." Jonah nodded. "Wyoming wind. But you'll get used to it." He wanted to say something to make Clara feel less strange, but the truth was that he was also confused. Jonah had been unaccustomed to having anyone standing next to him for years, especially a woman. Clara's small movements, her fingers gently smoothing the folds of her skirt, her eyes sharp and yet soft, made Jonah feel as if he were stepping back into a rhythm of life he had almost forgotten. Clara looked back at him, as if trying to guess if this man was the same as in the letter. She asked softly, "Mr. Mercer, are you disappointed to see me?" The question startled Jonah a little. He exhaled, slowly and deeply. "No," he replied. "I just feel we have all come a long way beyond what letters can express." Clara nodded slightly. A flash of gratitude, a flash of relief, flashed in her eyes. Jonah touched the handle of the first suitcase. "Let me carry your luggage." But as soon as he lifted the large trunk, Jonah noticed something strange. It was much heavier than he expected a woman to carry. Not clothes, not soft furnishings, certainly not anything light. Clara saw Jonah's eyes change slightly, so she replied immediately, as if she had prepared in advance. "Ah, and there are some things from my old job. Things that might come in handy living in a place like this." Jonah didn't ask further. He wasn't one to pry, especially not when someone wasn't ready to open up. But he sensed something more complicated lurking behind Clara's dark eyes. The two of them walked toward the cabin. The sun was sinking behind the western mountains, the remaining light tinting the fence a coppery red. Clara's steps were light, but Jonah could hear her breathing quicken with each sudden gust of wind. The journey, perhaps more than 1,000 miles, must have been tiring. The cabin came closer, with its long porch and the rocking chair Jonah sat in every night. "It's not big," Jonah said, opening the front door, "but it's warm enough. Yes, inside, the scent of pine, the fireplace, and the lingering coffee from the morning combined to create a feeling of life and warmth much greater than it looked from the outside." Clara stepped inside, and her eyes softened. The space was simple, but there was care, the hand of a man who knew silence, knew loneliness, and knew how to try to keep a home from getting cold. Clara put her gloves on the wooden table and looked around. "You keep a nice house," Jonah chuckled. "No one can help me clean up after myself." They both laughed softly. It was an awkward but warm laugh. It opened something between them, like the first crack that let the light in. Jonah led Clara to the prepared room, a sturdy wooden bed, a burgundy hand-woven blanket, a window facing the meadow. "Here's your room," he said. "I'll put new curtains in, too. It'll be cold in the winter." Clara placed her hands on the edge of the bed. "Thank you. I know it wasn't easy to prepare these things." Jonah simply replied, "I want you to feel comfortable. Starting out in a strange place is no small matter." Clara turned to look straight at Jonah, her eyes so sincere that he had to look away. "Jonah, I know I'm not the image the letters portray, but I hope this doesn't make you regret it," Jonah replied slowly. "I don't expect perfection. I just expect honesty." Clara's eyes softened, deeper and older, as if she had just heard what she had needed to hear all her life. Afterwards, Jonah invited her to have some warm water and rest. But when Clara opened the second chest, Jonah caught a glimpse of the contents' dense notebooks, some strange instruments that looked like anemometers and barometers, and even a small, locked wooden box. Jonah knew it was no ordinary bride's thing. He didn't ask, but he sensed from that moment that Clara Whitmore carried more than a life to rebuild. She carried secrets, pain, and perhaps fears that would follow her along the way. Jonah leaned against the doorframe and said softly, "Clara, if you need anything, just call me. This house, this farm. I'm used to living alone, but that doesn't mean you have to be alone." Clara looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "I thank you for letting me in." The door closed, leaving Jonah alone in the quiet. He could feel his heart pounding, harder than he expected. He had been waiting for a strange woman, but the woman who had just stepped out of the carriage was not like he had expected, not like the letters. not like anyone in his life. And that was what made Jonah Mercer feel his heart stir, like a small stream after many frozen winters. Clara's first morning at Mercer Ranch came in a soft, silver light, filtering quietly through the small bedroom window. The West had its own way of telling people that a new day had begun. There were no alarm clocks. There was no sound of wagons and carriages, as in the eastern towns. There was only the sound of wind blowing through the fields, birds perching on the stable roof, and Jonah's slow footsteps as he made his early morning cattle check. Clara opened her eyes and sat up slowly. Her back was aching from the long walk, but her mind was strangely calm. The room smelled of old pine. The pale yellow morning light softened the hand-woven blanket. She touched it lightly, noticing the care in each stitch. She thought to herself, Jonah Mercer may be a loner, but he's not as rough as he looks. When Clara stepped out into the main room, she saw Jonah standing by the fire. He was setting the coffee pot on the iron trivet. The window was open, letting in the morning dew. The moment reminded Clara of what she had left behind in the East, and what she never wanted to remember. Jonah turned and nodded slightly. "Good morning, Clara. Did you sleep well?" His voice was low and rough, like the sound of wood tapping on a door jamb. Clara nodded slightly. "I slept better than I thought I would." "Thanks for such a warm room." Jonah said nothing more, but his eyes softened, as if the words touched something quiet within him. They sat down at the wooden table. Jonah poured coffee, and Clara looked slowly out the window. She saw cattle grazing, Jonah's horse standing by the fence, and a sky so wide it felt like her breath had been released. "This place is so peaceful," Clara whispered. "I didn't think silence could be so vast," Jonah replied, as quietly as she did. "Being quiet here sometimes saves people. Sometimes it makes people so lonely they can hardly breathe." Clara looked at him for a few seconds longer. "I think I understand." He touched the rim of his cup lightly, as if unconsciously. "Silence is sometimes the only thing that keeps me going through things." Clara didn't ask what those things were. She felt she shouldn't. She had her own things she wasn't ready to talk about. The two of them sat there, not saying much, but not in an uncomfortable silence, like two souls used to living in isolation, learning to exist together again without disturbing that small peace. After breakfast, Jonah took Clara on a tour of the farm. He walked more slowly than usual, as if to give Clara enough time to observe, to get used to it, so as not to feel left out. They walked past the chicken coop, over 100 feet of wooden fence, and to the stables. Jonah introduced each horse with quiet pride, as he stroked the mane of Midnight, the black horse. Clara noticed that his hand, though strong, had a gentleness rare in Western men. Clara asked softly, "How long have you been doing this job?" "All my life," Jonah replied. "Ever since I learned to tie a leash," my father said. "The earth feeds you, so you must feed it by being kind." Clara smiled slightly. "It sounds like you have a lot of respect for him." Jonah was silent for a moment. The wind blew through his gray-brown hair. "I respect him, but his death and that of my little family have left me living like someone trying to keep myself from drowning." Clara exhaled slowly. She knew the pain. Not the same, but somehow similar. Loss makes people hide their soft sides like wild animals licking their wounds. "I'm not here to replace anyone," she said softly. "I just want to get my life back. If you'll let me." Jonah turned to look at her. His eyes were sad, but sincere. "Clara, I'm not looking for a replacement. I just need someone who won't run away when they see the emptiness of this place, and of me." Clara wanted to reply, but her words stopped as she realized a thought was stirring in her heart. She was afraid of being left behind, afraid that this man, after knowing the truth, would look at her differently, afraid that the past she had tried to escape would once again catch up with her. But she spoke. "I won't run away. Jonah, but I also want you to understand. I came here with more than just hope." Jonah looked at her a long time, as if trying to comprehend the implications of her words. But then he nodded. "I don't expect you to tell me right away. When you're ready, I'll listen." That simple sentence made Clara's nose suddenly sting. A Western man, seemingly as hard as stone, understood the complexity of silence. She turned away to hide her eyes, then walked out to the field to let the wind dry the rising emotions. That afternoon, Clara opened the special chest Jonah had seen yesterday. Inside, in addition to the notebook and the weather instrument, were some old papers, some barometric charts, and an unopened letter. Clara looked at the letter for a long time. She touched it lightly, as if touching a scar. Then she put it down again. No matter how far you run, the past follows like a shadow on a deserted field. Jonah stood in the yard, looking out the window at Clara. He saw her shoulders shake slightly in the wind, and he thought. Clara seemed stronger than she appeared, but also more fragile than anyone thought. As the sun slowly set behind the mountains, the two of them ate dinner in silence, the only sound being the clinking of spoons against bowls. Afterwards, they sat on the porch. Jonah reminded Clara to bring a shawl to keep out the cold. They watched the last rays of light dissipate in the crimson sky. Clara said softly, "This place is so peaceful that I feel like I can breathe again." "After a very long time," Jonah replied. "Then I am glad you came." Clara turned to look out over the vast expanse of the prairie, her heart suddenly tightening. She knew that peace was always the most fragile thing, and sometimes it was the moment before the real storm. In her heart, a voice rang out Jonah. "If you knew who I really was, would you still want me here?" But she dared not ask. Not now. Silence enveloped the porch, but this time it was a soft and warm silence. No one said another word, but both of them felt it very clearly between two broken people in two different lands. A weak but heartbreaking trust was forming. That belief will be what lifts them up, or it will be blown away by the western wind when the truth comes out. But not today. Today is just the first day of two people learning how to step into each other's lives again. Clara's second morning at Mercer Ranch began with a gentle knock on the door. It wasn't hurried, not nervous. It was steady, sure, like Jonah himself. Clara opened the door to find him standing there, his heavy coat in hand. "The wind's about to get stronger," Jonah said softly. "If you want to see more of the farm, this will keep you warm." Clara took the shirt, feeling the simple thoughtfulness in the way he folded it neatly and kept it clean despite its age. The West does not need flowery words, but small actions like that are sometimes warmer than words. Jonah led Clara along the east lawn, where the early morning sun cast tiny, dancing streaks of light across the ground. In the distance, the Granite Ridge Mountains loomed like a giant wall over the prairie. Clara stopped and looked up at the pale gray sky, gathering clouds to the west. "Mr. Jonah," she said softly, "the wind is about to change." Jonah turned. "You used to work with the weather." Clara stopped avoiding him. She looked toward the horizon, her eyes deep as if reading the language of the clouds. "More than 10 years ago. I worked at a meteorological observatory on the East Coast. It wasn't a big job, but I recorded data every day. Wind, rain, pressure. Everything had its story. Jonah listened in silence. He wasn't the curious type, but he felt like every word Clara said was revealing a part of her. Clara continued, "The weather never comes alone. It brings change. It brings warning. And sometimes, pain." Her voice dropped as she said the last thing, as if some memory was clinging. Jonah wanted to ask, but he restrained himself. He understood what it meant to have a memory that was not ready to be touched, and he respected that. They continued walking along the bank of the small stream. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the changing sky. Clara stopped and took a deep breath. "The water here is so clear," she said. "It's like everything hasn't fallen apart like it has in other places I've lived." Jonah looked at her, seeing the thin sadness hidden beneath her smile. "In the West," he replied, "things fall apart, but people here, they learn to put things back together." Clara bowed her head, her hands clasped together. A slight tremble in her eyes showed that his words had touched something within her. At noon, the two returned home to prepare a simple meal: cornbread, some bacon, and black coffee. While Jonah was busy slicing the meat, Clara opened the window to let in the breeze. Suddenly, she heard a slight creaking sound from the trunk. A feeling of unease came over her, like a sudden chill running down her spine. Jonah asked from the kitchen, "What's wrong?" Clara shook her head slightly. "No, just the sound of furniture moving." But she knew it wasn't that simple, because in that small wooden box, the one Jonah had accidentally found that first day, there was still something she wasn't ready to say. After lunch, Clara decided to help Jonah with some chores around the farm. Jonah watched her roll up her sleeves and pick up the wooden water bucket, and he chuckled. "You don't have to work so hard. People from the East are not used to farm work," Clara replied, her voice not harsh but firm. "I don't want to just stand by and watch. I want to belong here." "Jonah." Jonah paused at the word belong. It sounded like a small promise, shapeless but warmer than he thought it would. He nodded. "Then I'll show you something." They worked together in the afternoon sun, their rhythm slow and harmonious. Clara was not as clumsy as Jonah thought. She did everything with the carefulness of someone accustomed to observing, measuring, and remembering every detail. "Where did you learn these things?" Jonah asked when he saw that Clara knew how to fix fence ties. "From my father," Clara replied. "He believed that women should know how to protect themselves, not just with guns, but with life skills." Jonah mused. "Your father was a strong man." Clara smiled, but there was pain in her smile. "He was strong, but life isn't always fair to the strongest." As the afternoon wore on, the sky turned a pale purple. Clara and Jonah sat on the porch, drinking hot coffee. Neither spoke, but the silence between them was no longer distance. It was like a gentle stream glittering, gentle, and suggesting something growing. Clara looked back toward the road where the carriage had taken her the day before. She still felt the fear that someone from the past would find her. Jonah glanced over and saw her tense, so he asked, "Clara, are you okay?" She nodded, but her heart did not. There were some things one couldn't say in an afternoon, pains that had not yet subsided, things that had been hidden for years. Clara knew the time would come, but not today. A sudden gust of wind blew by, making Clara shiver. Jonah stood up. "The wind is up. You're right about the weather. We're going to have a colder night than usual." Clara looked up at the sky, her eyes sharper than usual. "It's not just cold, Jonah. The clouds are starting to swirl. Maybe the wind will shift tonight." Jonah chuckled. "You are a weather person." But Clara didn't smile. She felt something coming, an intuition she had had for a long time, an intuition that has saved many lives, but also caused her to carry an unjust reputation that she cannot shake off. Before entering the house, Clara turned back to look at the sky once more. The wind blew strongly, making her skirt flutter and her prematurely gray hair flutter. In that moment, Jonah stood in the doorway looking out, and he realized this woman was not as fragile as she appeared, but she was not as strong as she wanted to appear. Clara was the one who had weathered the storm, but perhaps the biggest storm of her life was yet to come, and Jonah, unbeknownst to him, was standing at the very center of that storm. That night, the wind began to shift, just as Clara had predicted. The first gusts across the Mercer Ranch prairie brought with them the chill that Westerners always feared. It wasn't the kind that made people shiver, but the kind that signaled a change in nature strong, sometimes fierce, like an awakening beast. Jonah pulled the window shut and looked around the small house. The oil lamp flickered, swaying in the wind. Clara sat at the wooden table, holding a cup of hot tea that she brewed the East Coast way. The steam rose from the tea, carrying a light herbal scent, giving the house a bit of warmth in the sudden change of weather. Jonah stepped closer. "Clara, are you okay?" Clara looked out the window, where darkness was falling like a thick blanket over the prairie. "I'm fine," she said softly. "It's just, the wind tonight is like the wind I used to know." Jonah sat across from her, his eyes on her face in the pale yellow light. Like what Clara was silent for a few seconds. She stroked the rim of her teacup, as if hesitating between keeping quiet or saying something that had been bothering her for years. "The last time I heard this kind of wind," she said slowly, "was the night everything in my life changed." Jonah did not interrupt. He knew that some stories could only be told when the speaker was truly ready. His gaze was not urgent, just a quiet presence, a stake keeping the unsteady one from falling. Clara took a deep breath. "That night, I was on duty at the weather station. A cyclonic storm suddenly formed over the sea. I saw the pressure readings drop rapidly, so rapidly that no one believed me when I sent out the warning." Her voice trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the memories that had lain dormant for so long. People thought I was panicking. They thought I was seeing things. And when the storm hit, it not only wiped out a lot of houses, it took my parents. Jonah clenched his hands, not because he was angry with Clara, but because he knew what it felt like to lose someone so badly. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Clara shook her head. "It wasn't anyone's fault, but from that night on, people called me hypersensitive, a fantasist. I was fired, and then I lived for years believing that my intuition was a burden, a curse." Jonah looked deep into her eyes. "Clara, your intuition has saved this farm for more than a few days. You see things others miss. It's not a curse. It's a gift." Clara pursed her lips, her shoulders shaking slightly. It had been a long time since she had heard such words. Words without doubt, without judgment. "Jonah," she whispered, "aren't you afraid I'll bring trouble?" "Clara," Jonah replied, his voice as sure as a wooden post driven deep into the ground. "Who in this world doesn't have troubles? It's a matter of where we choose to take them, and to whom." Clara turned away, and Jonah didn't see the slight tears in her eyes. She had lived too long in doubt, in the skeptical gaze of the world, and now, with just a few words from this quiet Western man, the wound in her heart felt as if it had been touched by a very gentle hand. But that rare peace did not last. A loud screech tore through the roof. Jonah jumped to his feet and walked to the window. "The wind has really changed direction," he said. "It's pushing sand from the west faster than I thought." Clara stood beside him. She looked up at the black sky that was spinning like a giant fan. "This wind," she whispered, "is a sign of an early dust storm." Jonah frowned. "It's not dust storm season, but the weather never follows the calendar." The two looked at each other, and Jonah nodded, as if accepting the fact that Clara's intuition might be right once again. He took out a lantern. "I need to check the stables before the wind picks up." Clara put on the shirt Jonah had given her that morning and followed him. The sky was so dark that only the lanterns and the moon, obscured by clouds, could guide the way. The wind was stronger, carrying with it the smell of dirt. As they led each horse into the stable, Clara saw Jonah's image emerge from the dusty night calm, steady and full of responsibility, a pillar in a changing landscape. But just when Clara thought the wind tonight would bring only bad weather, she realized something else. At the end of the fence, Jonah's lantern caught sight of something that made them both stop. On the soft ground, there were fresh tire tracks, clear, deep, unmistakable. Jonah bent down and touched the tracks with his fingers. "That wasn't my car, and no one around here would be driving past the farm at this hour." Clara took a step back. The night wind suddenly became colder, penetrating to the bones. "Jonah," her voice trembled slightly, "I think someone has been watching the farm since this afternoon." Jonah turned to her. "Why didn't you tell me? I'm not sure," Clara replied quickly. "I just saw a shadow in the distance, and I don't want you to think I'm suspicious for no reason." Jonah took her arm lightly. Not hard, but firmly. "Clara, you must always tell me. I don't want anyone, or anything, to scare you." Clara let out a small breath, as if a secret part of her had been pulled to the surface. She looked at the tire tracks, then at the wind sweeping across the meadow, whipping up thin wisps of dust. "It's not the farm that I'm afraid of," Clara said slowly. "I'm afraid that my past might find me." Jonah straightened. His eyes were colder than the night wind. "Clara, whatever you're carrying, you don't have to face it alone." Clara wanted to believe it, really wanted to believe it. But the truth was pulling her back into years of running from pain, and from a man she hoped would never find her. That night, the wind still howled over the roof of Mercer Ranch. But to Clara, what was more frightening than the wind was the approaching shadow. The next morning the sun rose late, as if it were wary of the night's turbulent winds. The air still smelled of dust, and the sky was a pale gray, not the clear blue Jonah had always seen on Mercer Ranch. Jonah woke before the rooster crowed. He hadn't been able to sleep since seeing the tire tracks outside the fence last night. He pulled on his thick coat and stepped out onto the porch, where the wind brought the chill of the night to his shoulders. But what weighed on his mind most was not the weather, but the shadow of worry that lingered in Clara's eyes before she went to sleep. Clara had been silent for a long time in the living room the night before, then said just one sentence, "I think my past is coming to me." Just that. No further explanation. Jonah stood on the steps, looking out over the dirt toward the fence where they had found the tracks. He was not a suspicious man, but his years in the West had taught him that nothing unexpected came without trouble. Clara emerged a few minutes later. She was still wearing the denim jacket Jonah had given her the first day, which had become hers without her realizing it. Her hair was tied back, but a few strands had fallen as the wind blew. "Have you been awake long?" Clara asked. "A long time," Jonah replied. "I wanted to look at the tire tracks again when the light was better." Clara was silent, then walked lightly to stand beside Jonah. She followed his gaze. "I know you want to ask," she said, her voice as small as the wind against the edge of a door. "But I'm not ready to tell you everything." Jonah didn't turn to look at her. He simply replied, "Clara, I don't want to pressure you, but if something threatens your safety, I need to know." Clara clutched the sleeve of her coat. "I understand, and I will tell you. When I can." Jonah nodded. No judgment, no urging. But Clara still felt a heaviness in her heart. Not for Jonah, but for herself, for letting the past follow her to what she hoped would be a new beginning. Jonah took the lantern and the wooden stick and walked quickly toward the fence. Clara followed, her shoes leaving light imprints on the soft ground. The tire tracks were still there, though the wind had erased some of them. Jonah knelt down and placed his hands in the deep furrow. This person does not walk fast. Clara bent down beside him. "How did you know Jonah pointed to the edge of the ditch? The tracks weren't stretched. The riders weren't trying to outrun the wind. They were moving slowly, as if they were watching, or waiting for someone." Clara shivered, and Jonah realized. "Clara," he asked softly, "do you think that man was your stalker?" Clara swallowed. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes looked out over the desolate horizon where her past might be approaching, inch by inch. "Maybe," Clara said, "or maybe not. I had people who didn't want me to leave, didn't want me to start a new life." Jonah stood up and walked over to her. "You don't have to run anymore." Clara looked at him, her lips pursed slightly. "I don't want to run anymore, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to stop." "You don't have to stand alone," Jonah said firmly. Clara wanted to believe that, but she knew such words were not light promises, not when she had not yet said everything she had to, and not when she was sure that the person chasing her was simply a lost shadow. Jonah turned back to check the fence. One of the wooden posts was out of place. It was unclear whether it was the wind or someone leaning against it. "Do you think they stopped here?" Clara asked. Jonah shook his head. "Hard to say, but I know one thing: they don't pass by randomly." Clara touched the dislodged piece of wood lightly. Her hand trembled, not from the cold, but from the sudden flood of memories. "Jonah," she said, her voice like dry leaves rustling, "I was followed for months before I left the East Coast." Jonah turned back immediately. "Who was following you?" Clara took a deep breath. She felt the old fear pulling at her from within. "I don't know his name. I only know he was hired, and he never showed up in person. He left only clues: a shadow in the distance, a car at night, a door ajar. I used to think I was imagining things. I used to think it was the pain that made me so sensitive." Jonah looked deep into her eyes. "But you ran away because of that?" Clara nodded slightly. "And the person who hired him still has a reason to want you back." Clara pursed her lips. "Maybe." Jonah stepped closer to her. There were only a few inches between them. "Clara, whatever your past, whoever is looking for you, I will not let anyone harm you." Clara closed her eyes, not from fear, but from the feeling of vulnerability that had just arisen. A part of her had grown so accustomed to being alone that now, hearing such sincere words of protection, she didn't know how to respond. Jonah continued along the fence. Clara followed a few paces until she stopped at a particular spot. Something was poking out from under the soft earth like a splintered piece of wood. "Jonah," she called softly. He turned and walked over to her. Clara pointed down. It was a piece of black painted wood, about the size of a palm, like a broken part from a box or the handle of some item. Jonah picked it up. turning it in the light. "Never seen this kind around here." Clara looked at it, her eyes widening slightly. "Jonah, this is the color they used to line old weather station toolboxes." Jonah froze. "You mean—" The tracker left his mark. "No," Clara said slowly. "I mean, that person has been to my station. Or had some connection." The wind blew harder, kicking up fine dust from the ground. Jonah clenched the piece of wood in his hand. "Clara," he said, his voice as sharp as a knife in the ground, "you need to tell me everything. Everything." Clara gasped. She knew this moment would come, and it came sooner than she expected. She looked at Jonah, a man of few words, quiet, but always standing like a cliff in the middle of a vast prairie, and for the first time in years, Clara felt she could not keep silent what needed to be said. "Jonah," she whispered, "the man who followed me that year wasn't just hired to scare me. He was hired to bring me back, at any cost." Jonah squeezed the piece of wood so hard it nearly broke. "Who hired him?" Clara looked straight at him. "My brother." The sky suddenly became heavy with gray, not because of the weather, but because the truth, spoken aloud, opened a new door into the darkness that Jonah and Clara would have to face together or alone. Clara looked at the piece of wood in Jonah's hand, then out at the vast prairie changing color under the fading sun. She knew this was only the beginning. That afternoon, the sky seemed to hold its breath. There was no wind, no bird song. The fields west of Mercer Ranch lay so still that Jonah felt every sound ring louder than usual, even his own heart pounding as he recalled Clara's confession that morning. Her brother, the person she trusted most in her life, the person who wanted to bring her back at all costs. Jonah wasn't a fearful man, but the words sent a chill down his spine, not from danger, but from the pain in Clara's voice, as if each word dragged a lingering fragment of her soul from the past. Jonah stood in the yard, his hands resting on the weather-worn wooden railing. The piece of black-painted wood he had picked up that morning was still in his pocket, heavy as a stone, impossible to throw away. Clara stepped out onto the porch, the pale sunlight touching the contours of her face. She stopped beside Jonah without saying anything, as if she knew he needed her presence more than words. "Would you like to sit down?" Jonah asked. Clara shook her head slightly. "I can stand. Maybe. It will be easier to talk." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. "Clara, I want the whole story. Not to judge, just to understand." Clara took a deep breath, the kind of breath people take who are used to living with fear and don't believe they have the right to share. "My brother's name is Solomon," she began, 7 years older than me. "When my parents died in the storm, he became my legal guardian. He's always been strong, determined, but also someone who saw control as the only way to keep things from falling apart." Jonah stood still. No interruption. "After I warned the weather station about the storm and no one believed me," Clara continued, "Solomon began to think I was unstable. He didn't trust my intuition. He didn't trust what I saw. He told me I had to let others decide for me, that I was too weak to be responsible." Clara's eyes were lost in space, as if looking through years of forced silence. "I loved the job." She choked. "But they fired me. Then Solomon tried to arrange for me to move in with him in Boston, marrying a man I didn't love because he believed he could manage me." Jonah squeezed the railing lightly. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving," Clara said. "I have no choice." Jonah looked at her for a long time. "Solomon sent someone to find you." Clara nodded. "He followed me for months, didn't touch me, didn't directly threaten me, just showed up, close enough to make me tremble, far enough away that no one believed me. Jonah felt his blood boil. And you think that piece of wood has something to do with him or Solomon? Clara replied, her voice dropping. If he knew I was writing from Montana, he might come. Jonah stood up straight. Clara, do you think Solomon wants to force you back? Or to hurt you, I don't know, she said softly. Solomon wasn't a bad person, but he was very sure that only he knew what was best for me. And when people like that feel like failures, they can act recklessly. Jonah stepped closer to her, just a few steps, but enough for Clara to feel his warmth spreading to her. Clara, he said softly but firmly, if anyone is coming here, they will have to go through me first. Clara looked up at him. Jonah, I don't want to put you in danger. I came here to start over, not to drag you into trouble. Jonah smiled a rare smile, warm enough to dispel the chill in the air. You didn't drag me into anything, he said. I walked in on my own. Clara wanted to appear calm, but her heart was pounding. In years, she had never had anyone stand by her the way Jonah was doing. Never had anyone say they were willing to risk their lives for her safety. And never had anyone look at her and not see a burden, just a person trying to live. Jonah turned away, but Clara noticed his hands were still shaking slightly, as if he was trying to contain stronger emotions than he intended. A moment later, Jonah said tonight, I want all the barns and sheds locked. I want to make sure no one can get in here without us knowing. Clara nodded, then took the scarf. I will help you. Jonah looked at her, his eyes a mixture of trust and worry. Clara, you don't have to. I do, she interrupted, her voice so firm it surprised even herself. I want to stand next to you. Jonah looked at her for a few more seconds, then nodded. They walked through the stables together. The breeze was blowing softly again, as if testing to see if it would come back strong again. Jonah locked every hinge, tested every bolt, every wooden latch. Clara held the lantern, the light flickering in her hand against the old wood, giving the stable an air of mystery, as if the story was unfolding that very night. When she reached the end of the barn, where it bordered the small forest, Clara stopped suddenly. Jonah, she called softly. He walked up to her. What's the matter? Clara pointed to the edge of the woods. A boot print clear and fresh was imprinted on the soft, damp ground. Jonah bent down. The shoe print was large and wide, the kind worn by a man of considerable build. And what stopped him was what Clara said next. He used to wear shoes like that. Jonah stood up, his face dark in the lantern light. Clara, he said, his voice low but firm. Come inside. Clara wanted to protest, but she saw the fire in Jonah's eyes. Not the fire of anger, but the fire of protection. The fire of a man who had spent his life fighting the elements, and was now ready to fight a man. Jonah, Clara said, her voice low. You can't. I can, Jonah replied, and I will. Clara took a step back, then stepped forward. Then let me stay in the house. But you have to promise not to go alone. Jonah did not answer at once. He looked again at the footprints, then at the darkening woods. He knew the man was still out there somewhere, closer than they thought. Finally, Jonah said softly, I promise I won't be stupid, but I won't let him near you. Clara put her hand on his arm. Jonah, thank you. Jonah looked at her hand on his, then at her face, where the light reflected a fragile yet real faith that made his heart ache. Clara, Jonah said, his voice softening, You don't know what that means." Clara withdrew her hand, but in that moment, something changed. Not in the words, but in the breathing, the look and the closeness without touching. Jonah walked Clara to the porch and watched her enter. Before closing the door, Clara looked at him one more time. "Jonah, don't stay away from home too long tonight." Jonah nodded. "I'll be here. I promise." But when the door closed, and Clara was no longer in sight, Jonah reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of black painted wood. He looked at it for a long time. "Solomon Whitmore," Jonah whispered, "if you're really coming here." The night wind blew stronger, like the whisper of the steppe. "Then you will have to go through me first." Night fell on Mercer Ranch, an unnatural silence. No crickets, no coyotes howling in the distant woods, just a silence as taut as a frayed string. The sky was overcast, swallowing the moonlight, leaving shadows so deep you could believe you were standing in a room with no exit. Jonah stood on the porch, his eyes turned toward the dark woods. The lantern hanging from the porch pole swayed in the breeze, sending shivering streaks of light like the breath of a nervous man. Clara watched him from the glass door. She didn't call out, but Jonah could feel her eyes on him. Her worry was like a thin, cold mist that settled over his heart, making his breathing heavier. Jonah put a hand on the butt of his gun. He wasn't one to settle matters with violence, but the West wasn't a place for meekness. And tonight, he sensed something was coming that couldn't be persuaded by words. Suddenly, Clara opened the door. She wrapped a thick scarf around her neck and stepped out onto the porch. "Jonah." Jonah turned back. "You should stay inside. I don't want to leave you standing out here alone." Jonah wanted to protest, but when he saw the determination in her eyes, he knew he couldn't. Clara wasn't the type to give in to fear. She faced it with a powerful silence, a silence Jonah had never seen in anyone. Clara stood next to Jonah, her eyes fixed on the distance. "Do you feel it? How do you feel?" "The air," Clara said softly. "It changes, like storms don't come from the sky, but from people." Jonah looked at her, and he realized what he had never noticed before. Clara didn't just read the wind or the clouds. She read the invisible atmosphere around people, the things only those who have been crushed by life can understand. Clara looked up at the distant hill, and at that moment, she grabbed Jonah's arm. "Jonah, look, on the low hilltop to the north, a figure stood still as a statue, not moving, not approaching, just standing there, watching." Jonah jerked his body together, protective instincts rising like wildfire. "Get inside. Clara." No, she shook her head, her voice trembling but determined. "If it's him, I don't want to hide. I want to face him." Jonah looked at the figure, then at Clara. If he meant harm, he wouldn't just stand there and watch. Clara tightened her grip on his sleeve, but he always does that, from a distance. "I'm scared." Jonah put his hand on her shoulder. "Clara, you're not alone anymore." She took a deep breath, then nodded. But as Jonah started to step down the steps, Clara stopped him. "Jonah, before you go, I need to say something." Jonah turned back, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her eyes filling with tears. "I came here to start over, but I've brought so much trouble with myself. I don't deserve this." Jonah was slightly stunned by that. "Clara, you didn't drag me into this. You dragged me into your life. And he paused, as if realizing he had just ventured too close to a truth he did not dare look straight at. Clara looked at him, waiting. A small breeze blew her hair aside, revealing gray-blue eyes that trembled with emotion. Jonah took a deep breath. "I want you here. Whatever the past, whatever the future holds, I want you here." Clara bit her lip. "Jonah, you don't understand. People like Solomon, they don't give up. When they don't get what they want, they destroy everything." Jonah stepped closer. "Clara, I'm not afraid of anyone coming for you. The only thing I'm afraid of is leaving you alone." Clara paused. A long, silent, brilliant moment connected them in the thick darkness. Then Jonah turned away, his eyes returning to the figure. But it was gone. Jonah paused. "Clara, come in. Jonah, Clara. Now." Clara saw something in Jonah's eyes that was no longer normal wariness. It was the alertness of a hunter who knows his prey has changed position, but doesn't know if it has slipped into the shadows or is behind him. Clara stepped inside, her heart still out on the porch. Jonah went down to the yard and walked towards the fence. The darkness swallowed him up bit by bit. Only the light of the lantern in his hand cut through the darkness. Clara stood close to the glass door, her hand on the frame, her eyes never leaving Jonah for a second. Jonah walked over to where the figure had been standing. The footprints were deep in the dirt, clear, new, and bigger than the shoe prints they had seen that morning. Jonah knelt down. He touched the footprints. The ground was still warm. Someone was standing here not more than 5 minutes ago. Jonah looked around. The forest behind him was silent, but not a natural silence. It was the silence of something hidden, looking back at him. The sound of a branch breaking came from the bushes. Jonah stood up. "Gun ready. Come out," he called, his voice booming. "I know you're there." There was no answer, but Clara, from the window, saw what Jonah didn't. A figure moved quickly through the trees, disappearing into the deeper darkness. She opened the door and ran out onto the porch. Jonah. He went east. Jonah turned quickly, but the figure was gone. He turned and ran towards Clara, his voice sharp as a knife cutting through the wind. "Clara, what did you see?" "I only saw Sil," Clara choked. "Just a shadow. But I know he looked at me before he left." Jonah put a hand on her shoulder. "So he will come back. But next time, not from afar." Clara tightened her grip on his sleeve. "Jonah, I fear this will not end easily." Jonah looked into her eyes that hid the fear of years without shelter. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling slightly but firmly. "I don't know who that person is. I don't know what awaits us. But I do know one thing." He reached up and gently touched her trembling hand. "From the moment she got off that bus, I knew. She no longer had to run alone." Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in years, tears fell not from despair, but from someone standing by her side unconditionally. Jonah squeezed her hand gently. "Whoever it is, whatever happened, I'm not going anywhere. Do you hear me? Clara?" She opened her eyes. "Jonah, I hear." On the distant hill, the darkness was still thick, as if keeping the secret of who stood there. But inside the Mercer ranch house, another light had begun to shine, the light of two people finding each other in the midst of danger. And they all know, tonight is just the beginning. The next morning came strangely clear skies, mild sunshine, even sparrows perched on the roof of the stable. There was no trace of the previous night's tension. It was as if the prairie had swallowed up all worries and returned a thin layer of peace to Mercer Ranch. But Jonah and Clara both understand this peace is just a shell. Jonah sat on the steps, his shoes a little dusty from the night before. He hadn't slept much, only a few hours, The memory of the figure on the hill lingered in his mind. Clara came out, holding 2 cups of hot coffee. She placed one in front of Jonah and sat down beside him. Her eyes looked tired, but her voice was as gentle as ever. "Can't you sleep?" Jonah shook his head. "What about you?" Clara took a sip of coffee, the heat making her eyes close slightly. "I slept a little. But—" She paused. "I kept hearing footsteps outside." Jonah turned to look at her, his gaze serious. Really, Clara bit her lip. "I'm not sure. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was the fear." Jonah put down his coffee cup. "Clara, I'm going to put a lock on the back door, and I want to check the woods one more time before sundown." Clara was silent. Then she placed her hand on his sleeve. Lightly, but clearly enough for Jonah to feel the struggle inside her. "Jonah," she said, "I don't want you to think I'm just a nuisance." Jonah chuckled, a rare but warm laugh. "Clara, if you bring trouble, then I will gladly accept it." Clara looked at him. A flicker of confusion crossed her eyes, but then she smiled, a small, fragile, emotional smile. Then Jonah stood up. "I need to go out into the field. There's something I want to check." "Do you want me to come with you?" Clara asked. Jonah looked at her, the morning sunlight reflecting off her hair and eyes, and for a moment he wanted to say yes, but then he shook his head. "Not today. I want you to rest." Clara understood. It wasn't that Jonah didn't want her to come. It was that he was afraid something would happen if she were there. Jonah stepped out into the field. At first, everything looked normal long grass, old hoof prints from last week, a few familiar cacti. But then, as he approached the eastern woods where Clara had said she had seen the figure running last night, he stopped. Under the ground, there are new footprints. Jonah bent down. The ground was soft, new, very new. He stood up straight, his eyes scanning the trees. No sound, no movement, but he felt as if someone was standing somewhere, watching his every move. Jonah pulled the gun from its holster, not raising it, just holding it the way Westerners face what they cannot name. He walked a few steps into the woods. The sunlight filtered through the foliage, cutting golden streaks across the ground. The streaks illuminated something caught in a low thorn bush. Jonah looked down, his heart stopping in his chest. A piece of gray cloth, not the kind of fabric people around here wear. Not Jonah's, and certainly not Clara's. He rolled the cloth in his hands and turned it over. A distinctive stitch ran along the edge, a stitch he had seen on expensive coats, usually found only in the Northeast. Jonah inhaled sharply. This guy isn't from Montana. A feeling of unease welled up in him, but he didn't turn back. Jonah walked a few more steps, and then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A new track, not a footprint, a hoof print from a horse. A strange horse had stood here near his house, near Clara during the night. Jonah turned back, walking faster. When the porch came into view, he saw Clara standing there, her hand shielding the sun, her eyes looking worriedly at him. "Jonah," she called. "What's wrong?" Jonah held up the cloth. "I found this." Clara went down the 3 steps and looked carefully, and immediately her face turned pale. "Jonah, that's the kind of fabric Solomon wore. Only he would order it this way." Jonah looked at her for a long time. So he is very close. Clara put her hand to her mouth, as if trying to keep her breath from cracking. Jonah put his hand on her shoulder. "Clara, we'll talk about this inside. This isn't a safe place." They went back into the house. Clara sat down on a chair, her hands shaking slightly. Jonah put the cloth on the table and stood by the window, looking out at the fields. "Clara," Jonah said in a low, steady voice, "what I need to know now is, what does Solomon want from you?" Clara closed her eyes. Struggle, regret, fear, it all rolled into one. "I think," she breathed, "Solomon wanted to take me back, to take control of my life again. He believed I couldn't live alone, that I always needed someone to make decisions for me. But that's not bringing back," Jonah said. "That's confinement." Clara opened her eyes. "I know. So why do you say he is not a bad person?" Clara looked up at Jonah. "Because Solomon isn't evil, just damaged. He lost both his parents, just like me. But instead of grieving, he chose to control everything, so he never lost anything else." Jonah was silent for a long moment. "But to protect his pain," he said slowly, "he was willing to hurt her." Clara bowed her head. "Yes, and now he's out there somewhere, coming closer." Clara trembled slightly. "Jonah, if my coming here puts you in danger, I can leave. I don't want you to have to." Jonah interrupted immediately, his voice as loud as a rock falling to the ground. "No, Clara, no." Clara was stunned. Jonah stepped closer to her, so close that Clara could feel his breathing, warm and intense. "You leaving will only make him come faster, and you'll be out there, alone. I can't allow that to happen." Clara looked at him, her eyes sparkling with emotion. She tried to keep from falling into tears. "Jonah," she choked, "you don't owe me anything." Jonah leaned closer to her, his voice dropping to a barely concealed admission. "Clara, I owe you everything." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Jonah backed away, looking at the oil lamp on the table as if searching for the right words. "Ever since you got off that bus, I've been the same man I was before, and I won't let anyone take you away from here." Clara was so moved that she couldn't speak. She just looked at Jonah, quiet, strong, but right now, emotional. Jonah put his hand on the table, next to hers, not touching, but enough for her to feel the warmth. "Clara, I will protect you," he said softly, "even if your past comes to a head, even if your brother is behind it all. I will not back down." Clara looked into his eyes, and for the first time, instead of being silent with fear, she was silent with trust. "Jonah," she said, "thank you." Jonah didn't answer. He just nodded, his eyes returning to the window. And in the far edge of the woods, there was a slight movement. A shadow passed like the wind. Jonah clenched his jaw. "He is testing us," he said. Clara stood beside him. Fear had a name, but so did faith. And they all understood tonight. We'll not be peaceful anymore. The noon sun washed over Mercer Ranch in a pale white light filtered through 100 layers of dust. The vast western sky was not its usual blue, but a hazy gray, as if wavering between sun and storm. The wind blew cool enough to rattle the old doors and make Clara feel as if someone were standing right behind her, though she knew she was alone in the kitchen. Clara placed her hands on the edge of the table, trying to steady her breathing. She had lived for years in fear of being watched and hunted, but never as much as she did now, not because Solomon was approaching, but because for the first time she had something to lose. She straightened when she heard Jonah enter. There was dust on his coat, and his eyes were heavy with caution. "Have you finished checking the west side?" Clara asked. Jonah nodded. "Nothing. But that doesn't make me feel any better." Clara shivered slightly. "Jonah, if Solomon really is close, what do you think he's waiting for?" Jonah sat down in a chair, his hands on his knees, I think he wanted to see how we would react, wanted to see how much you feared him." Clara was silent. She knew it was true. Solomon always wanted to control other people's emotions, especially hers. Jonah looked at Clara, his eyes softening. "Clara, you haven't told me the whole story between you and Solomon. I don't need to know all the details, but I need to understand. What does he want from you?" Clara stood by the window, her hands clasped together. She thought for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the truth was too heavy to say. Then she turned back. "Jonah, Solomon wasn't a violent man, but he was someone who couldn't stand losing control. He wanted me to be a part of him, something that wouldn't leave his sight." Jonah leaned back in his chair. "That's not love." Clara nodded slightly, her eyes downcast. "I know, but for years, I didn't see it. I thought he cared. I thought he was protecting me." "From what?" "From life," Clara replied sadly. "He said so, that I was too soft, too sensitive, too vulnerable. And I believed it." Jonah looked straight at her. "Clara, you are not weak." She smiled sadly. "Jonah, I used to be afraid of the sound of a door slamming, afraid of someone disagreeing with me, afraid of a disapproving look. That's what Solomon created in me, by always saying that he was the only one who could decide things." Jonah stood up and walked towards her, his voice low but clear. "Clara, you have come thousands of miles to escape him. A weak person cannot do that." Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with emotion. "I don't think I'm as strong as you say, because no one has ever said that to you," Jonah replied. A long moment passed between them, a moment of silence, but thick with truth, the truth that they were both changing, thanks to the other's presence. Then Clara took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "Jonah, I want to tell you something I've never told you. What made me leave Solomon's house?" Jonah looked at her, waiting silently. Clara clenched her fists. "A year ago, I wanted to leave the city. I felt suffocated. I wanted to live where the sky was wide open, the land was wide open, the wind was free. When I told Solomon that, he laughed, not a happy laugh, but like I had said something stupid." Jonah frowned. "He said I had nowhere to go, that no one wanted me, that no one wanted a woman as broken as me, and that I had to stay, because only he could put up with me." Jonah clenched his fist so hard his knuckles turned white. "Clara," Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly, "that night I cried in my room. I realized I wasn't living. I was just existing. And I left, without a word." Jonah put his hands on the table, as if to steady himself. "You did the right thing. But Jonah—" Clara looked at him, worry filling her eyes. "If Solomon finds me, I fear he will try to take me back there." Jonah stepped closer to Clara, standing a few feet away. His voice was deep but firm as the earth. "Clara, you have two things that Solomon can no longer have." Clara blinked. "Two things first," Jonah said. "You have freedom. You earned it yourself. And anyone who touches that freedom will have to go through me." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "And the second thing?" she asked softly. Jonah looked at her for a long moment, his eyes softening in a way that made Clara take a deep breath to calm herself. "Secondly," he said slowly, "you have me." Clara was speechless. She just looked at Jonah as if what he had just said had opened a door she had never dared to consider. But before she could say anything, there was a loud neighing of a horse from outside. Jonah turned immediately, his hand on the butt of his gun. "Don't go out there alone," Clara said quickly. "I have to see," Jonah replied. But as he reached the door, Clara touched his arm. It was a brief moment, but it was a storm of emotion. "Jonah, if anything happens to you—" "It's nothing," Jonah said, his voice more reassuring than certain. He stepped out onto the porch. Clara stood inside, her hands gripping the doorframe, watching him as he walked down the steps. In the open space before the stable stood a black bay horse, striding and panting heavily. Jonah could tell at once that it was not the farm's horse. Clara also noticed it from afar. She put her hand to her mouth and whispered in deep fear, "That is Solomon's horse." Jonah looked at the saddle. Too familiar, too expensive, and unmistakable. But the scariest thing is the empty saddle. There is no Solomon. No one. But where did the horse come from? From what direction? And for what reason? Jonah stroked the horse's mane, trying to calm the animal. But the animal's eyes reflected primal fear, the fear of an animal running for its life from something terrible. Clara ran out onto the porch, her eyes wide with despair. "Jonah, if the horse is here, then where is Solomon?" Jonah tightened his saddle strap, looking out into the dark abyss of the forest. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I think he's not out there anymore." Clara shuddered. "What do you mean?" Jonah raised his head, his eyes fixed on his house where the upstairs window shook slightly as if someone had touched it. "I mean," he whispered, "he went into the woods. Maybe. Very close." Clara took a step back, her breath ragged. Jonah turned to look at her. "Clara, tonight we won't just be waiting." Clara clutched the edge of her coat. "Jonah, I'm scared." Jonah walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. "Clara, you don't have to be afraid." And Clara knew. The confrontation was no longer in the future. It has begun. Afternoon fell on Mercer Ranch quietly but heavily, like a blanket covering everything. The last light stretched in dark gold streaks across the cracked earth, then disappeared as the sky turned a dark purple of winter. Jonah stood in the front yard, his hand on the butt of his gun, his eyes still fixed on the woods north of where Solomon's horse had come from.
The wind rustled through the trees, creating a long, rustling sound that sounded like someone moving through the underbrush. Jonah didn't necessarily trust other people's intuition, but he did trust his instincts, and his instincts were sounding the alarm right now. Behind him, the front door opened softly. Clara walked down the steps, her woolen coat fluttering in the wind. She held a newly lit lantern. The small flame in the glass case flickered like the heartbeat of a heart that hid a much greater fear. "Jonah, we can't stand outside like this forever," Clara said, her voice calm but her eyes tense. "You should stay in the house and lock the door," Jonah replied. "Just one night." "Clara, I can follow the horse tracks tomorrow morning. It's too dark now." Clara shook her head. "If he's around, I don't want you out there alone. I've been running from Solomon all these years in fear. I don't want to stand behind someone and tremble again." Jonah turned back to look at her. "I don't want you to confront him, but this is my life," Clara replied softly. "Not just yours." Jonah was silent. He could feel the change in Clara, no longer the woman who was always ready to apologize, or always wondering if she was bothering anyone. She was standing there, in the cold wind and the dark, afraid, but not backing down. There was something about it that made Jonah feel both proud and heartbroken. He nodded. "Okay, but you stay with me. Don't leave," Clara breathed out, feeling a little relieved. Before he could say anything, an unusual noise came from the stables. Not loud, not clear, but strange. A slight rustling of wood, as if someone had just bumped into a railing.
Jonah immediately held out his hand, signaling Clara to stand behind him. The two walked slowly toward the stables. The wind was so cold that their breaths turned to white wisps that drifted in the darkness. As he got closer, Jonah stopped. He could clearly hear footsteps. Human, not animal. Clara stood right behind him, her hands clutching the lantern handle. Jonah placed his hand on the cage door and pushed it open gently. The lantern light shone into the void for only a few seconds before falling on a figure. Clara was speechless. Jonah immediately raised his gun, but then he froze, for the man standing in the stable was not Solomon. It was a boy of about 16, thin, his clothes torn and muddy, his blue eyes full of worry. He stood in the middle of the haystack, his hands raised in fearful surrender. "Please don't shoot," he cried. "I'm not a thief. I swear. I was just hiding." Jonah narrowed his eyes, lowering his gun a bit. Hiding from who? The boy swallowed. From that man on the black horse. He was injured, and he was mad because he couldn't find the man he was looking for. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. You met Solomon?" The boy nodded quickly. "Yes. He passed by me this afternoon. His sleeve was bloody. His eyes were red, as if he had a fever. He asked me if I had seen a brown-haired woman in the carriage. Then he threatened to tie me to a tree if I lied." Jonah looked at Clara, his eyes sharp. "He's hurt. Probably fell off a horse," Clara whispered. "Or someone else did it," Jonah replied. The boy continued, his voice shaking as if he were about to cry. When he left, the horse suddenly got startled. It threw him off the saddle. He fell down the bank. I thought he was dead, but he wasn't. He got up and went into the woods this way. I was so scared. I ran after the horse. The horse ran straight here. I don't know where this place is." Jonah lowered the gun completely. He knew all too well the fear in the boy's eyes, the same fear Clara had carried with her all her years with Solomon. "What's your name?" Jonah asked. "Evan," he replied. "Evan Price." Clara took a step forward, her voice softening. "Evan, are you hurt?" He shook his head. I'm scared he'll find me." Jonah spoke quickly and clearly. "Evan, you're safe here, but you need to tell me which direction is he going." Evan pointed north into the woods. "That way. I think he's making his way back to the farm." Clara took a deep breath. "Jonah, he knows which direction I came from. He knows I can't go far. Jonah, he'll be here." Jonah nodded slowly. "Yeah, and it's possible. He's closer than we think." Evan shuddered. "Uncle Jonah, you don't know him. He talks like he's crazy, like he's got one thing on his mind." Jonah asked softly. "What finder?" Evan replied. "At all costs." Clara gripped the lantern handle tightly, her breath coming in short gasps, though she had been preparing herself for months. Hearing it from a strange boy brought all her old fears back like a flood. But something stronger than fear stood beside her. Jonah left a long pause before saying, "Evan, you stay inside with Clara. Lock the door. Don't open it, for anyone but me." The boy nodded vigorously. Clara walked up to Jonah. "Jonah, what are you going to do?" Jonah looked deep into her eyes. "Let's get this over with." Clara shook her head vigorously. "Alone, Jonah. He's not in his right mind. Facing someone like that is Clara." Jonah put his hand on her shoulder. "I'm not doing this to be strong. I'm doing this because you don't deserve to keep running. Not again." Clara felt her heart clench. "Jonah, I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Clara." Jonah said softly but firmly. "You are not a burden. Never." Clara didn't know where she found the strength, but she reached up and took Jonah's hand. The small action spoke louder than any words she could have ever uttered. Jonah squeezed back slightly. "I will return." Clara looked at him, her eyes glittering in the lamplight. "I've been waiting for you." Jonah nodded, then turned and walked toward the dark woods. He was tall in the darkness, his steps steady but not without tension. Clara stood watching, until the figure disappeared into the shadows of the forest. "Beside her," Evan asked softly. "Grandma Clara, can Uncle Jonah win?" Clara did not answer immediately. She looked into the dark forest where Jonah had disappeared. Then she whispered, "I don't know, but I do know one thing. If anyone has the heart to find a way back, it's him. Light thunder in the sky, and the chase begins." Night fell over Mercer Ranch as if someone had pulled a thick curtain over the sky. No moon, no stars, just a thin layer of winter mist creeping into every corner, making every sound seem more mysterious and heavy than usual. The sounds of insects faded, as if they, too, were holding their breath in anticipation of what was coming. Jonah walked into the northern woods with his pistol at his side and a small lantern in his hand. His footsteps made a sound that was almost lost in the wind. Jonah knew this forest better than anyone. But tonight, it was no longer an absolute ally. Tonight, the woods were strangely silent, as if nature itself knew that another darkness was creeping in. Jonah stopped and listened. In the distance, a twig snapped, then stopped. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't the wind. It was a man. He lowered the lantern so the light wouldn't betray his position. The cold seeped through his coat, making him feel the pounding in his chest. It wasn't from fear. Jonah had faced far more danger in blizzards and dry seasons. But this time, there was something he hadn't felt before, the feeling that he wasn't fighting for himself, but for someone else, for Clara. He walked deeper into the forest, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The tall trees stood still like the stone columns of an ancient church, except this place had the familiar smell of damp wood and forest floor. As he passed a large tree, the light flickered softly, illuminating something on the ground. Jonah bent down. It was a few drops of blood, still fresh. He reached out and touched his fingertips, then stood up, his eyes sharp. The trail of blood stretched deep into the bushes. Solomon was truly wounded. That was both an advantage and a danger. A wounded man, mad and obsessed, often without the rationality to calculate the consequences. Jonah followed the blood trail, walking steadily but slowly. He did not want to be ambushed. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell of iron from blood became. Then suddenly, a hoarse sound rang out from somewhere ahead. Jonah Mercer. Jonah stopped short. The sound was not loud, but it was clear. It was hoarse with cold and sarcastic, and Jonah recognized it immediately. Solomon was here. Jonah raised his gun, his gaze scanning the dark woods. "Come out, Solomon. Staying in the shadows won't make you stronger." A low, twisted laugh rang out. "You think I'm hiding from you?" The wind blew harder, making the branches tremble slightly, as if the whole forest was waiting for an answer. Jonah said slowly, "I think you are desperate." There was a long silence. Then a figure stepped out from behind the trunk of the giant tree. Solomon stood there, his coat torn at one side, his left arm clutching his bloody side. A long gash ran from his shoulder to near his hip, his face gaunt, but his eyes were unnaturally bright. They were not the eyes of a sane man. It was the look of someone who had completely lost control. "It turns out," Solomon said, his voice choking, "she was telling the truth. She came running to you." Jonah kept his hands steady, but his voice was calm. Clara wasn't running to anyone. She was running from me. Solomon raised his eyebrows, his smile curving like a knife. "She doesn't understand. Clara is someone who needs to be guided. She's weak. She needs me." Jonah didn't move, but the words made him feel a simmering anger welling up in the pit of his chest. "You're wrong," Jonah replied. "The only thing Clara needs is to live her own life." Solomon laughed, then stopped in his tracks as the pain from his wound intensified. He braced one hand against the tree trunk, but his voice was still defiant. "You think you know her? How long have you known her? A week? A month?" He gritted his teeth, his eyes bloodshot. "I loved her for years. You can't take her from me." "I don't love Clara," Jonah replied, his voice low but sharp as cold steel. "I just want to possess her." Solomon tilted his head, his eyes dark. "Owning, loving, sometimes makes little difference. Jonah." Jonah raised the gun to Solomon's chest. "I don't want to shoot, but if you take one more step toward my house, I will." The atmosphere was tense as a bowstring. Solomon looked at the gun, then at Jonah's face. He exhaled deeply, white smoke forming a thin mist in front of his eyes. Then he spoke, his voice low. "You will not shoot. You try," Jonah replied. Solomon chuckled. "You know what I'm like." Jonah did not answer. Solomon took a step forward, unsteady but still stubborn. "The difference between us is that I would do anything to keep the one I love. And I," Jonah said, "will do anything to protect the one I love, even from you." At that moment, the wind stopped blowing. The trees seemed to stop shaking. Solomon closed his eyes for a second, then opened them with a hateful look. "Then let's see who she chooses." He lunged at Jonah, a sudden movement, faster than Jonah thought a wounded man could make. His fighting instinct made Jonah back away, raising his gun higher. But before he could pull the trigger, Solomon slipped in the wet mud and fell forward. Jonah held the gun, not firing. Solomon rolled down the slope behind him, hit a tree, and lay still. Jonah stood still for a moment, listening to see if he moved. Then he heard a groan. Solomon was still alive, but too weak to stand. Jonah walked down the slope, keeping a safe distance. Solomon looked at him with anger mixed with the fear he tried to hide. Jonah said, "Solomon, I don't want to kill you, but you need to stop. Clara doesn't belong to you, and you know it." Solomon gasped. I have nothing but her. Nothing." His voice was choked, almost pleading. "You don't understand. I've lost everything." Jonah didn't lower the gun, but his voice softened. "If you really love Clara, let her go. Let her live." Solomon pursed his lips, his eyes watering with pain. I don't know how." Jonah looked at him for a long moment. In that moment, he no longer saw a dangerous pursuer, but a broken, disoriented man, not unlike the souls he had seen during the long, harsh winters. He put the gun down low. "Solomon," Jonah said softly, "I need help." Solomon opened his eyes, his gaze both desperate and angry. Then suddenly, he reached into his coat. Jonah immediately raised his gun again. But when Solomon pulled his hand out, what was in his hand was not a gun, but it was a crumpled envelope, the edges torn, the ink smudged by the rain. Solomon held it up. "She left this on the table before she left." Jonah didn't take it. He just looked. Solomon smiled bitterly. "You think I chased her to kill her? No, I chased her to ask why. The wind blew hard, making the leaves swirl under their feet. Jonah looked at the envelope, then at the face of the broken man before him. And he realized, tonight was not the last match. This is just the beginning of the real confrontation. The night wind crept through the forest like a living thing, touching Jonah's skin with an ominous chill. He stood just a few feet from Solomon, the weak light from his lantern reflecting off the man's face as he lay against the tree, pained and desperate. In Solomon's hand was a crumpled envelope, a small object, but its weight made Jonah feel a sinking feeling in his stomach. Jonah looked at it for a long time and said, "Show it to me." Solomon's lips curled up in a smile that was both sad and as if to prove that he still had something Clara couldn't hide. "I kept it, all the way to find her," Solomon said hoarsely. "It was all I had left between me and her." Without further delay, Jonah bent down and carefully pulled the letter from Solomon's hand. The edges of the paper were soft with water, the ink smeared as if someone had shed tears on it. Jonah brought the lamp closer. Even though the handwriting was faded, Jonah could still read what Clara had written. Jonah swallowed slowly. "Solomon, I'm leaving. I'm not leaving you because I hate you, but because I'm no longer myself in that house. I'm not leaving you. I'm just finding myself again. Please don't look for me. Please don't force me to come back. If you still love me, let me go." Below is the last line. In slightly shaky letters, "Clara." Jonah felt his chest tighten. The letter was too kind, too painful, and too true to Clara. Solomon looked at him, his eyes no longer filled with the anger from before only deep hurt. "You see," he said softly. She left without further explanation, just left those vague words and disappeared. How can I accept that Jonah folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket? "Clara's kindness," he said slowly, "is what makes you not understand her." Solomon narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "She never dared to say you hurt her." "Because she thought silence would make it less painful?" Jonah straightened. "For some people, silence is the only way to survive." Solomon was startled. The statement was like an arrow that went straight to what he knew but would never admit. "I didn't treat her badly," Solomon said, his voice choking. "I gave her shelter. I gave her safety." Jonah replied immediately. "You gave her what you thought was safe, but you never asked her what safe meant." Solomon leaned his head against the tree trunk behind him, his eyes fixed on the dark, uncertain sky. In the distance, the owl's cry echoed, sounding like the endless sigh of the entire forest. "After a long while," Solomon said softly, "do you know, Clara wrote me dozens of letters, gentle, devoted, always thinking of my feelings." Jonah looked straight at him. "She wrote that because she was afraid of disappointing you." Solomon clenched his jaw. "You know nothing about her." "I know more than you think," Jonah replied, his voice even and calm. "I saw Clara when she laughed with her hands shaking, when she talked with her eyes on the ground, when she heard a door slam and jumped as if someone was standing right behind her." Jonah took a step closer. "I saw her fear," he said slowly. "The thing you never see." Solomon swallowed hard, his eyes red with anger, pain, or exhaustion. Jonah wasn't sure. "She is mine," Solomon spat out, his voice distorted. "Nobody belongs to anybody," Jonah said. "Clara chooses herself, and you have to let her live." Solomon did not answer. He only breathed heavily, his breath mingling with the wind. A dark cloud blocked the light from the oil lamp. The space became dark for a few seconds. As the wind blew the clouds away, Jonah saw Solomon struggling to stand up. "You shouldn't have stood up," Jonah said. "I don't need you to tell me what to do." Solomon growled. He staggered to his feet, his left hand clutching his wound, his right hand clutching the tree trunk. Once strong, Solomon was now a shadow of his former self, but the shadow still held on to his shattered pride. He looked at Jonah, his eyes showing the tragedy of someone who believed all his love had been stolen. "Jonah," Solomon said softly, his voice no longer challenging, "if you hadn't shown up, Clara would have returned to me." Jonah shook his head. "No, she left long before I met her. You just won't accept it." Solomon closed his eyes. A drop of water sweat, or tear fell to the ground. In that moment, Jonah no longer saw an enemy. He saw a man who didn't know how to deal with loneliness, who didn't know how to let go, who didn't know how to love freely. Jonah said slowly, "I'll take you back to the farm. Get your wounds tended to, and tomorrow morning you'll leave this place. Forever." Solomon laughed dryly. "You think I could leave? Not when Clara was there, not when she looked at you with the look I've longed for all my life." Jonah's fingers tightened around the gun, but his voice didn't change. "Clara won't see me, and I won't force her again." Solomon gasped, then tilted his head to look back toward the farm. "She's in that house," he whispered, "with the child, with you looking into Jonah's eyes." Solomon fell into a blind panic. "I can't bear it. I can't bear it if she chooses someone else." Jonah took a half step back, his hand on the butt of his gun. Solomon looked at him strangely. "Jonah," he said, his voice suddenly too light for the turmoil in his eyes, "if I can't have her, you can't even dream of keeping her." He turned and staggered back toward the farm. "Solomon, stop." Jonah shouted, but Solomon did not stop. And Jonah understood everything Clara feared had come true. No more pity, no words, only action left. Jonah ran, labored but determined. The night wind tore at his face. The ground beneath his feet heaved with each stride. Because in the house where the yellow light was flickering, Clara was waiting. Little did she know that the storm was actually headed her way. And Jonah knew tonight, everything would be decided. The night wind howled across the wooden roofs of Mercer Ranch as if warning of something about to tear apart. Jonah dashed across the backwoods, mud splashing into his boots. The cold cut through his coat, but he felt nothing but the worry clutching his heart. The house in front is still lit. Clara's there, and Solomon was coming from behind, like a desperate ghost. Jonah ran faster, his breathing growing heavier with each step. He knew Solomon was weak, badly wounded, but desperation had a way of turning men into creatures more dangerous than any wild beast. As Jonah approached the porch, the front door suddenly opened. Clara appeared in the golden light, her face worried. "Jonah, is that you?" Her voice trembled. Jonah wanted to reply, but all he could do was raise his hand and gesture. "Clara, get inside now. Lock the door." Clara was stunned. What Clara Jonah almost shouted, "Get in quickly." Clara saw Jonah's eyes and knew something was wrong. She stepped back and closed the door, but Jonah knew she wouldn't lock it right away. Clara was too kind for moments like this. Jonah turned back and saw Solomon appear at the edge of the light, like a figure torn from the darkness. His eyes were wild. His breathing was labored. His coat was torn. One hand clutched at his bloody side, the other clawing at the air as if trying to grasp something slipping away. She is in there. His voice was vague. Like someone sleepwalking. She is mine. Jonah raised his gun. Solomon, stop. You take one more step, and I will be forced to do something I don't want to do. Solomon laughed, a hoarse, creepy laugh. You think you can save her from me? You think my love is so easily severed? He staggered forward. Solomon, I don't want to shoot, Jonah said slowly, but I will if necessary. No. Solomon shook his head, his breath coming in short gasps. You think I came here to kill her? No, I came to reclaim my heart. Jonah tightened his grip on the gun. You can't win someone's heart by scaring them. She owes me, Solomon snapped. She owes me loyalty. She owes me what I sacrificed. Does she owe you her freedom? Jonah replied, his eyes never leaving him. You have trapped her in a fear she dares not name. Solomon paused, only for a second, but it was enough for Jonah to see real pain flash across his face. Then Solomon lowered his voice, vaguely as if talking to himself. She left me, without an apology. Jonah shook his head. Clara doesn't owe you an apology. You made her forget herself. Solomon angrily took another step toward the porch. Jonah held his breath. Before he could react, the door of the house opened again. Clara stepped out. Her face turned pale, her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were no longer afraid like before. She looked straight at Solomon. Stop! Please don't come any closer! Solomon did stop, stopped as if held by an invisible string. Clara. He called her name like the cry of a wounded animal. You! Can't you talk to me just once? Just one last time. Clara swallowed, trying to calm herself. She knew Jonah was right behind her, his gun still trained on Solomon, but she also knew there were words only she could say. Solomon, Clara said, her voice still trembling but clear. I left because I was no longer myself. I tried for years. I kept quiet for years, but I couldn't go on like this. Solomon winced as if he had been hit in the face. You left me. For him, no. Clara replied immediately. I left for me. Jonah was just the one who gave me a chance to breathe again. Solomon did not understand, or did not want to understand. He took another step. Clara, listen to me. I can change. I won't let you go again. Jonah stepped quickly in front of Clara, completely blocking her and Solomon. She's not coming with you. Solomon. Enough. Solomon looked at Jonah, his eyes widening. Who do you think you are? You came after me. You came after me and took everything I had left. Jonah didn't blink. True love can't be taken away. It's just the things you hold on to, even though they're no longer yours. That statement made Solomon explode. He pulled a small object from his pocket. Jonah tensed for a moment, thinking it was a gun. But no, it was just a leather bracelet Clara had knitted herself. Solomon held it up, trembling. She gave this to me for my birthday. She said I was her only family. Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Solomon, I didn't know how to refuse. I thought I could exchange you for my kindness, but I was wrong. Jonah heard her voice break at the last sentence. Solomon gasped, the sound more a groan than a word. I don't want to live without you. Solomon. Clara opened her eyes. You will live. Just let me live my way. At that moment, something in Solomon's eyes slipped. One last trust broken, and with that, he lunged towards Clara. Jonah reacted instinctively. He pushed forward, pushing Clara back into the house, raising his gun. Stop. But Solomon was too close. Jonah took a step back, preparing to fire. Solomon rushed forward, and at that moment, his legs gave way due to the severity of his injuries. He collapsed on the steps, his body collapsing as if the earth itself was pulling him down. The bracelet fell from his hand and rolled to the ground. Solomon lay there, panting, his eyes on Clara in a final plea. No more anger, no more possessiveness, just the pain of someone left behind. Clara took a half step forward, tears welling up in her eyes. "Solomon, I'm sorry, but we're gone a long time ago." Solomon pursed his lips, his eyes finally turning to Jonah. "Take care of her," he whispered. "Don't let her be scared, like I was." Jonah leaned down. "I will." Solomon closed his eyes. Not dead, just exhausted, completely. Jonah stood up, breathing heavily. His whole body shook slightly from the tension that had built up since the night before. Clara walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "Jonah, are you okay?" Jonah turned to look at her, his eyes filled with unspoken emotion. "I'm fine," he said, "as long as you're safe." Clara leaned against him, trembling slightly, but for the first time in years, not with fear. Outside, the night wind still whistled through the fences, but for them, tonight was no longer a night of fear, but it is the night of an end and a new beginning. Dawn crept slowly over Elkwood Valley, a pale golden light spreading across the remaining patches of snow. Mercer Ranch, after a long, tense night, was strangely quiet. The larks began to sing, a soft, silent toast to those who had weathered a storm more violent than any winter storm. Jonah stood on the porch, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, his eyes on the long path that curved through the fields. Everything seemed peaceful today, but the echoes of last night still lingered in his heart. He never thought his life would come to such a major crossroads, the kind that would determine whether a person had the right to be happy or not. The door opened softly. Clara stepped out, clutching her scarf tightly around her neck. Her eyes were slightly red, not from crying, but from lack of sleep. Jonah turned, a soft smile on his face. "You don't need to get up so early," he said. Clara shook her head slightly. "I can't sleep. There's too much to think about." Jonah put his coffee cup on the railing and walked over to her. "Solomon is still asleep. Carter is watching. Dr. Miller will be here this morning." Clara nodded slightly, her eyes looking down at the ground. "Jonah, thank you. If it wasn't for you last night, I don't know what would have happened." Jonah placed his hand on hers, gently but firmly enough to let her know he was really there. "Clara, I was only doing what anyone would do to protect someone they care about." Clara looked up and met his eyes. "I know, but not everyone would stand in front of a desperate man who would do anything like that." "I promise to protect you," Jonah said, his voice lower and more sincere than ever. "And I will keep my word." Clara took a deep breath, as if to steady her heart. "Jonah, I don't want to let fear dictate anything, but last night forced me to see one thing clearly. I no longer belong to my old life." Jonah was silent. "There are times when silence is the only language gentle enough." She continued, "I chose to leave because I wanted to live. But when I met you, I learned what it was like to be seen, to be heard, not judged, not constrained." A gentle wind blew, carrying the scent of dry grass and melting snow. Jonah looked deep into her eyes, but his voice remained calm. "Clara, are you sure? After everything that happened, you have the right to rest. There's no need to make a decision right away." Clara smiled, her smile less strained this time. "Jonah, I've never been more sure of anything." Just then, The sound of hooves came from afar. Carter Hale, Solomon's brother, rode up. Carter was a quiet man, always keeping his distance, but his eyes lit up when he saw Jonah step onto the field. "How is Solomon Carter?" asked. Jonah sighed. "Weak, but okay. He's no longer a threat." Carter nodded. "Good. I'll take him when he's fully awake. Solomon needs treatment, but also needs to face the truth about how he's been living. Today was the first time I've seen him break down like that." Clara stepped closer, her voice soft. "He needs help, not just physically, but mentally. Solomon never learned how to love properly, and I was wrong to stay silent for so long." Carter looked at Clara with sympathy. "You are not the cause. Sometimes people don't know how to heal themselves. Solomon had to find his own way." Jonah stood next to Clara, his eyes shifting to Carter. "We don't want Solomon punished. We just want you to take care of him. As for the rest," Carter understood. "I know, and I will." After Carter left, Clara and Jonah returned to the porch. The sun was higher, the light growing stronger, casting gold across the valley. Mercer Ranch seemed larger, more alive, as if the air today held new promise. Clara turned to Jonah, her voice soft, but each word seemed to speak her heart. "Jonah, I'm staying. Not because I'm afraid to leave again, but because I want to be here with you." Jonah was silent for a long moment. He wasn't the type to talk much, but his eyes said everything. He placed his hand on Clara's cheek, slowly, carefully, as if touching something sacred. "Clara," he said in a low, husky voice, "you are more than I ever dreamed possible, and if you choose to stay, I promise I will never let you be afraid again. Not by the past, not by anyone." At that moment, Clara leaned her head gently into Jonah's palm. She didn't cry. Sometimes tears are no longer necessary when the heart has found a place to rest. Jonah pulled her into his arms. They stood there in the morning light, like two people who had found each other after a lifetime of being lost. No fuss, no fanfare, just trust and a love born from the deepest, most beautiful place in pain. Over the next few weeks, Mercer Ranch slowly returned to normal. Elkwood townspeople stopped by more often, bringing greetings for the upcoming harvest. Clara opened a small clinic next to the main cabin, where she cared for the villagers, especially the elderly and lonely ones. Jonah helped her put up extra windows to let in the morning sunlight. Everyone realized something had changed between Jonah and Clara, a new peace, light as a breath, yet as solid as a Montana rock. Even if no one asks, they all know. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light over the countryside, Jonah and Clara sat on the front steps. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. Jonah looked out at the wind-swept fields and said softly, "Clara, you know, when you got off the bus that day, I thought I was just picking up a strange woman, but it turns out I was picking up my heart." Clara smiled, her eyes sparkling in the twilight. "Jonah, sometimes it takes half a lifetime to understand that home isn't a place to live. It's a place with people you want to come back to." They held hands. Nothing more was needed. No grand promises were needed. Just the warmth of their hands, and the knowledge that from that day on, they were no longer alone. A chapter of life closes, a new life opens. On Mercer Ranch, where two broken souls find their way back to the light. Looking back at the story of Jonah and Clara, we realize something that seems simple, but is a truth that permeates our entire lives. We are not born to be alone. No matter how strong we are, deep inside every heart there is a small corner waiting to be seen, touched, and healed. Silence sometimes helps us survive, but only love, kind, respectful, understanding love can revive us. At 60 or any age, we all carry old wounds, losses that are hard to name. But like Jonah and Clara, we still have the power to open our hearts once more. Because happiness doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from finding someone who makes that pain worth enduring. Thank you to our viewers, especially those who have passed half of their lives and still choose to stop here to listen to a story. If these things touch your soul, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring you warm and hopeful stories.